Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Livermore Indivisible. I'm Joanne, and we're going to be explaining the ballot propositions to you today. There are 10 of them, so we're going to be fairly pressed for time. These are the measures that we're going to talk about. At the end of each presentation, we'll have time for maybe a couple of questions. And then if there's time at the end, we'll take more questions about any of them. So this is being recorded. So tell your friends if they weren't able to be here today, they can watch it on the recording, which will be posted on the Livermore Indivisible website. So I'm going to begin with Proposition 2. And this is for bonds for public school and community college facilities. And a yes vote would allow the state to borrow $10 billion to either build or renovate existing public school and community college facilities. And of course, a no vote, then the state could not borrow the money. So really, the schools in California are in very poor condition. They have leaky roofs, broken air conditioning, peeling paint, and other health and safety hazards. Some districts are using portable classrooms that have been there for 30 years or more, like in Livermore. And California doesn't pay for school repairs through a regular funding stream like other states do. The money comes entirely from state and local bonds. So the more affluent school districts have an easier time raising money, theoretically, although if they're conservative, they don't. But smaller and lower income districts really have a hard time raising that money. The California voters last approved a state bond measure to fund public education in 2016. And in 2020, they defeated a bond measure, that was Prop 13, to fund public education facilities. And now the fund for repairs is very low and will probably run out by January. So Proposition 2 authorizes $10 billion in general obligation bonds, and that'll cover repair, upgrade, and construction of facilities at K through 12 public schools, and that includes charter schools, community colleges, and career technical education programs, including for improvement of health and safety conditions and classroom upgrades, which is really important. This measure requires annual audits. It provides $8.5 billion for the K through 12 schools and $1.5 billion for community colleges to renovate, fix, and construct new facilities. And the money, here's the good part, will be distributed through matching grants, with the state paying the greater share of costs for the less affluent districts and those with higher numbers of English learners and foster youth. Approximately $150 million would be set aside for removing lead from water, creating transitional kindergarten classrooms, and building career and technical education facilities. Next slide. So the arguments for the proposition: many schools and community colleges are outdated and need basic health and safety repairs and upgrades to prepare students for college and careers and to retain and attract quality teachers. Prop 2 meets those needs and requires strict taxpayer accountability, so funds are spent as promised, with local control, requires annual audits, which will be done locally. The arguments against it: Proposition 2 will increase our bond obligations by $10 billion. which will cost taxpayers an estimated $18 billion when repaid with interest. A bond works like a government credit card. Paying off that credit card requires the government to spend more of your tax dollars. Vote no on Prop 2, they say. So here are all the supporters. State Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Association of California School Administrators, California Labor Federation, California Chamber of Commerce, California Federation of Teachers, California School Boards Association, League of Women Voters of California, Small School Districts Association, California Republican Party, California Democratic Party, and California State Strong. That's part of Indivisible. A total of $5.75 million has been invested in this ballot measure, and that includes monetary and non-monetary contributions. The opponents are the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and no reported contributions in opposition to the measure. So the fiscal impact would be increased state costs of about $500 million annually for 35 years to repay the bond, which comes out to about $17.5 billion total. The Legislative Analyst's Office reported that California is now repaying an estimated $80 billion in bonded debt and is authorized to sell an outstanding $35 billion in bonds. So it's within the amount that's authorized to be sold. And the state spends approximately $6 billion from the general fund. That's 3% of the total fund each year to repay bonds. So what does this mean in Livermore? Livermore would need to pass a bond measure to receive a contribution from the state bond funds. We don't know what the proportion of matching funds would be. I don't know how they would evaluate Livermore for matching funds. We do have a lot of English learners, but I don't know whether we're considered really a low-income area. But LVJUSD, the district, has a facilities master plan to modernize and improve schools. It's been on the books for a while now. And the first phase was funded by Measure J in 2016. And the phase 1 projects have been completed now, includes things like, the wonderful new athletic facilities we have at both high schools. But a further bond measure, Measure G, to fund phase 2 projects failed to pass in 2022. So the question is, would Livermore voters be more willing to pass a bond measure if there were matching funds from the state? Or would they, again, reject an increase in local taxes because of the economy and whatever? So a lot of voter education is necessary to make voters aware of the remaining needs the district is facing, because they think, well, you already had a bond, Measure J for your master plan, isn't that enough? And they don't realize that only covered the first phase, and that there's still a great need out there. We have a lot of facilities that are in really bad shape. So is that the last slide? And here are the resources I used for research. And I will take questions. No questions? Okay. I guess there are no questions. So I am going to turn this over now to Christine Kanza, and she's going to talk about Prop 3.
Thank you, Joanne. So Proposition 3 is the constitutional right to marriage proposition. It is a legislative constitutional amendment. A yes vote would update the language in the California Constitution to match who currently can marry. There would be no change in who can marry. And a no vote would mean that the language in the Constitution would not be changed, but there would also be no change in who can marry. So some background to Proposition 3. In 2008, Californians passed Proposition 8, which defined and recognized as valid only marriages between a man and a woman. Prop 8 was overturned by the state Supreme Court in 2010. In 2015, the federal Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage nationally with the Obergefell versus Hodges decision. Nevertheless, Prop 8 is still in the California Constitution. Next slide. The proposition was put on the ballot by the legislature. So some key points are that Proposition 3, if it passes, would formally repeal Proposition 8. It would amend the California Constitution to recognize the fundamental right to marry regardless of sex or race. And it would remove the discriminatory language in the California Constitution stating that marriage is only between a man and a woman. In other words, it would catch up to current law. Arguments for Proposition 3, and this is important to remember in our current climate. The Supreme Court of the federal Supreme Court's current right-wing majority has indicated their interest in overturning Obergefell v. Hodges. So it would ensure that marriage equality is protected in California, even if the Supreme Court of the US eventually overturns national legalization. California has been in a leadership position in protecting civil rights and individual freedom. This is one step, to stay with our reputation, so to speak. Interestingly, Nevada at this time is the only state that has amended its state's constitution to protect marriage equality. So the arguments against Prop 3, they allege that it removes all rules for marriage, opening the door to polygamy, child marriage, and incest, and that it would harm families and society. It doesn't change any of the current laws, so I question that argument against that proposition. Who are the supporters? Many LGBTQIA+ and progressive groups, as you can see, the ACLU of California, Courage California, Human Rights Campaign, the League of Women Voters of California, Equality California and Reproductive Freedom for All California, Sierra Pacific Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, and California State Strong, one of the indivisible groups, collective group in California. The opponents, also 4.1 million was raised in support of Proposition 3. For the opponents, interestingly, California Capital Connection, a Baptist lobbying group, is one that's mentioned, and then some individuals, Jonathan Keller, of the California Family Council, and a Reverend Tanner DiBella. To me, interestingly, is that there's much less opposition from groups who work tirelessly to pass Proposition 8, meaning that a marriage is only between a man and a woman. And those churches have said much less about this now. And those are the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Catholic Church, and the San Diego branch of the Church of Scientology. And there were no contributions reported against Prop 3. Fiscal impact, there's no change in revenues or costs for state and local governments. Next slide, please. So these are the resources that I've used, and they will be on our website if anyone cares to, look at them further. Next slide, please. Oh, rather, I'm sorry. Do we have any questions on Prop 3? If there are no questions, we'll go on to Proposition 4, which I've also looked at. This has to do with basically climate change remediation, for parks, environment, energy, and water. It is also a bond measure. A yes vote would mean that the state could borrow $10 billion to fund various activities aimed at conserving natural resources and responding to the causes and effects of climate change. It requires 55% of the vote to pass. A no vote would mean that the state could not borrow $10 billion to fund these activities. Next slide, please. Some background. These entities, the state, the federal, and local governments, all can pay for natural resources and climate activities. The state either pays upfront with money it already has, or by borrowing using bonds that are paid back over time. For the last decade, California spent about $13 billion annually on natural resources and climate activities. Of that amount, 15% has been from bonds. Nevertheless, California failed to adequately prepare for droughts and the changing climate. So some key points. Again, the ballot, the legislature put the proposition on the ballot as it is required to do. The proposition would, if passed, provides for safe drinking water by cleaning up and protecting water supplies and storage, preventing and mitigating wildfires and smoke, protect communities from extreme heat, improve clean energy infrastructure, and protect forests, beaches, rivers, and wildlife. It potentially would save billions by avoiding or reducing future disasters. It requires 40% of the bond money to be used for activities that directly benefit lower income communities or those that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So how would this money be spent? On drought, so the categories are listed on this slide. So for drought, flood, and water, it would be $3.8 billion, and that would be used to increase the amount of quality and water available for people to use and to reduce the risk of flooding as well as dam repairs. Forest health and wildfire prevention, $1.5 billion. It would be used to improve the health of forests and protect communities from wildfire by thinning trees and forests, clearing vegetation close to where people live, and helping homeowners make their properties more resistant to wildfires. Sea level rise in coastal areas, $1.2 billion. Money would be spent to reduce the risk from sea level rise and restore coastal areas and wetlands and improve ocean habitats. Land conservation and habitat restoration, 1.2 billion. It would be used to restore natural areas to protect wildlife, but also could be used to buy land that will in the future not be able to be developed. Energy infrastructure, 850 million. That is to support the state's shift to more renewable sources of energy. It would go towards building wind turbines off the California coast, transmission lines for that energy, and also for batteries to store the energy for future use. There would be $700 million for parks, to expand parks, to repair local and state parks, and to expand recreational opportunities at parks. That could include building new trails and parking lots. It would also provide grants to communities. Extreme heat, 450 million, and that is intended to reduce the effects of extreme heat in communities by adding trees and green spaces, and support people and places to go to for when there are heat waves and or disasters. Farms and agriculture, 300 million. That's to help farms respond, or farmers to respond to the effects of climate change and to become more sustainable. Hopefully to improve soil health, use less water, and reduce pollution. It would also support community gardens and farmers markets. Next slide, please. So arguments in favor, it would help shift from disaster response to prevention. It proposes an urgent and proactive common sense investment to protect communities, health, economy, and natural resources. It does require annual independent audits for how the money is spent. Arguments against, the bonds are an expensive way to fund government spending. The 10 billion bond would cost taxpayers almost $2 to repay for every dollar spent. Water and wildfire mitigation are necessities and should be budgeted for, not bonded. Mismanagement led to this crisis. Nevertheless, in my opinion, we have the crisis. So just because it wasn't planned for properly doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it now. So supporters for this proposition are Clean Water Action, CAL FIRE Firefighters, National Wildlife Federation, the Nature Conservancy, League of Women Voters, the ACLU of Northern California, Courage, the California Democrats, and California State Strong. Almost $700,000 was raised in support. The arguments against are the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the California Republican Party, and no money was raised in opposition. So what is the fiscal impact? About $400 million annually for 40 years to repay the bond. Payments would be made from the state general fund, which is the fund the state uses for most public services. This would be less than 0.5% of the state's total general fund budget. The total cost of the bond would be about 10% more, adjusted for inflation, than if the state paid up front with money it has. It could help California governments, local governments, save money that they would otherwise have to spend. The activities funded by this bond could reduce the risk or amount of damage from disasters and reduce state and local costs for responding and recovering from them. And again, these are the resources I used, which would be available for you to go to when the presentation is on our website. Any questions? All right, I would be happy to pass on to the next person, which is Joanne, and she will be talking about Proposition 5. Take it away, Joanne.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, so Proposition 5 would lower the supermajority requirement to 55% for local bond measures to fund affordable housing and public infrastructure. And now sometimes the requirement is 2/3. So a yes vote would mean that certain local bonds and related property taxes could be approved with a 55% vote of the local electorate, rather than the current 2/3 approval requirement. These bonds would have to fund affordable housing, supportive housing, or public infrastructure. A no vote would mean that certain local bonds and related property taxes would continue to need approval by a 2/3 vote of the local electorate. So California makes it difficult for local governments to borrow money. Not only do most city and county bonds require voter approval, they need the support of at least 2/3 of those voting to pass. Prop 5 would amend the California Constitution by lowering the required threshold to 55% for any borrowing to fund affordable housing construction, down payment assistance programs, and a host of public infrastructure projects. Assemblymember Celia Aguilar Curry, a Democrat from Winters, California, has been trying and failing to get some version of this on the ballot since 2017 because it's so difficult to get money for affordable housing to pass. After some changes in the original measure, the proposition now only covers bonds, and also now includes a ban on local governments using the money to buy up existing single-family homes to convert them into affordable units. So the key points of this bill, it allows local bonds for affordable housing for low and middle income Californians, or for public infrastructure, including roads, water, and fire protection, to be approved by 55% of voters, rather than current 2/3 approval requirement. The bonds must include specified accountability requirements, including Citizens Oversight Committee and annual independent financial and performance audits. And those would be done locally by local committees. It allows local governments to assess property taxes above 1% to repay affordable housing and infrastructure bonds if approved by 55% of voters, instead of the current 2/3 approval requirement. And that's a big one because until now, the assessment has been limited to 1% or less for local governments to assess. And so that's kind of a big change. Next. So the arguments for Prop 5 gives local voters more control over funding for affordable housing and vital infrastructure projects. We have a massive shortage of affordable housing for low and middle income Californians. Prop 5 gives local communities more tools to make housing more affordable. In addition to affordable housing, Prop 5 makes it easier for local voters who choose to invest in safety repairs and improvements to bridges, roads, public transportation, water systems, and other critical public infrastructure as they see fit. Prop 5 does not raise taxes. It simply gives voters more power to address the unique needs of their communities without relying on the state, which has not met the challenges facing most California families. Next. So the arguments against the proposition will change constitutional requirements that have existed for 145 years by reducing the voter approval requirements to pass bonds. California already has more debt than any other state, with more than 500 billion in state and local debt. Prop 5 puts taxpayers on the hook for even more, saddling future generations with the bill. Bonds are not free money. Bonds have to be paid back with interest, and taxpayers pay those costs through higher property taxes. And it allows politicians to cover up their mess by shifting the costs for state programs to local taxpayers. By making Prop 5 retroactive, politicians hope to saddle taxpayers with billions in new taxes and debt immediately. When they say that Prop 5 is retroactive, it means that it would apply to any bonds that are passed in this election as well as the future. So also it makes everything more expensive when Californians can least afford it. I think Californians can least afford housing right now, but those are the arguments against. The supporters are California Democratic Party, California State Building and Construction Trades Council, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, California Housing Partnership, California YIMBY, California Labor Federation, League of Women Voters of California, United Way Bay Area, and California State Strong. The opponents are the California Association of Realtors, California Chamber of Commerce, California Taxpayer Association, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, National Federation of Independent Businesses, California Republican Party, and Catalyst for Local Control. The fiscal impact would be increased local borrowing to fund affordable housing, supportive housing, and public infrastructure. The amount of increased borrowing would depend on decisions by local governments and voters, because they would still have to reach that 55% majority. And you can't always do that. Borrowed funds would be repaid with higher property taxes. And here are the resources that I used for this. And all of this will be on the Livermore Indivisible website. So can I have any questions, please?
Joanne, can I ask a question? This is Marla. So you said that part of this proposition would be a ban on using the money to buy existing family homes to convert them into affordable units. What was the reason for that ban in this proposition, and how does that impact anything?
Sure. It was part of the negotiations that happened in trying to get this on the ballot. I'm not sure the reasoning behind it. It seems innocuous. I don't know what the downside of it would be. So, but it took so long to get anything on the ballot for this. I guess it was necessary.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Okay. Next is Proposition 6. And let's see. I forgot who's next. Helen?
Me. Yes.
Yeah, Helen. Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Okay, Proposition 6, which I feel is one of the easiest ones to vote for. It eliminates constitutional provision allowing involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. A yes vote, the CA Constitution would be amended to prohibit the state from punishing inmates with involuntary work assignments and from disciplining those who refuse to work. A no vote, the California Constitution would not be amended and involuntary servitude would continue to be allowed as punishment for a crime. Background. The California Constitution bans involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, but it does not define involuntary servitude, which is a problem. Key points. Prop 6 would ban involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime and ban state prisons from disciplining people who refuse to work. It's on the ballot for legislative constitutional amendment. In the legislature, all but 3 people voted to approval for this. One of the key points is that people would be allowed to work for rewards which they could use for early release, which is a good thing. Okay, next slide, Karen. 4, a number of other states have adopted similar measures. Inmates have faced retaliation for turning down jobs that can be dangerous, life-threatening, and or contribute nothing to future skills or rehabilitation. Inmates have also been punished for missing work to attend classes, meetings, such as AA, etc. They, for the jobs that they're doing, a number of inmates have wanted to do education or job training sorts of jobs within the prison and jail system, but instead were expected to do jobs that they had not signed up for. And retaliation is limiting visiting privileges, limiting phone calls, all sorts of things. And again, this kind of depends on who's running the jail that you happen to be in, but it's a possibility as it is. There are no Proposition 6 arguments against. Okay, next. The supporters are the ACLU California Action, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, California Democratic Party, California Teachers Association, California Black Legislative Caucus, California Labor Federation, League of Women Voters, Voters of California, California Professional Firefighters, CA State Strong. The opponents are Howard Jarvis, Taxpayer Association, and California Republican Party. Fiscal impact is uncertain. A bill much like this was proposed 2 years ago, and Newsom refused to sign it because it would require that the inmates be paid minimum wage. And he was worried about the fiscal impact. Now, the suggestion is that people would receive credits towards early release. They do receive a small amount of money for working, but a lot of these jobs are less than desirable for their future, assuming they get out and would like to do something. As an idea of how much money they can make, the inmates who become firefighters in our horrible fires can make all the way up to $10 a day fighting fires. So our sources, it's kind of a no-brainer. I'm sorry, I think. The sources I use are the CA Voters Guide, the ACLU, Cal Matters, Anti-Recidivism Organization. It all makes being in prison, which is not or in jail, not a good thing, a little bit more bearable. And now on to Karen and Prop 32.
Were there any questions that?
Oh, sorry.
Helen, before I start?
Forgot that.
Okay, I'll get started with Proposition 32, which is the $18 minimum wage initiative. If you vote yes, it supports increasing the state minimum wage to $18 per hour by 2026 for all employers, and thereafter adjusting the rate annually by increases to the cost of living. If you vote no, it maintains the existing law that was designed to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour for all employers by January 2023, and increasing it annually according to inflation. So it's estimated that if you vote no, that the minimum wage would be about $17 by 2026. The background of minimum wage, as most things in California, is a bit complicated. Senate Bill 3, which was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Brown in 2016, increased the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour for all employees by January 2023. Thereafter, SB 3 allows increases based on the US Consumer Price Index. Now, nearly 40 California cities have local minimum wages that are higher than the state's, including 6 that already require at least $18, and several include a small inflationary adjustment. In 2023, Governor Newsom signed AB 1228, which increased the minimum wage for fast food employees to $20, and that went into effect April 1st, 2024. So fast food workers are getting $20. Also, in October 2023, Governor Newsom signed Senate Bill 525, which will increase the minimum wage for healthcare workers to $25 per hour in the coming years. Depending on the size and characteristics of the employers, this transition occurs over 2026, 2027, and 2028. The MIT Living Wage Calculator estimates a single adult with 0 children working 40 hours a week requires in Modoc County a $20.32 minimum wage. Now, why do I mention Modoc County? Because Modoc County is the poorest county in California. The statewide average for making it on a minimum wage is $27.32. Key points for Proposition 32, large businesses, it would raise the minimum wage to $17 by the end of 2024. And they would be required to pay at least $18 by January of 2025, which would be coming up in a few months. Small businesses with 25 or fewer employees, which in January 2025 would start paying $17, and by 2026 it would be $18. And then starting in 2027, the minimum wage would be adjusted based on inflation, just as our current SB3 already does. If adopted, California would have the highest minimum wage. Why is this on the ballot? Well, it was funded by one individual, Joe Sandberg, who's a wealthy startup investor, and he invested over $10 million. He tried to get this on the ballot in 2022, but somehow failed based on I don't know if it was not enough signatures or whatever, but he failed. And now it's on the ballot in 2024. That's why there's such a drastic increase between $17 this year and $18 next year for employers with 26 or more employees. Arguments for, it would provide a raise to 2 million workers. Money would help families afford basic needs and would be spent at local businesses and help reduce low-income Californians' use of taxpayer-provided benefits. UC Berkeley studies have found that California's gradual increase to $15, which this would not be, had no significant effect on job losses. Against, employers already face increased supply and labor costs from inflation. The market, not the state, should drive wages, and the state government, which facing a budget deficit, delayed a $25 healthcare worker minimum wage until this fall to see if it has the cash to cover it. Private employers should get the same benefit. Now, Governor Newsom has just indicated that the $25 healthcare worker minimum wage will go into effect starting this fall. The money raised has been over $11.4 million, and that most of it has come from one individual, Joe Sandberg, and the money against has been $65,000. Now, what are the supporters and opponents? The people who support this, the California Democratic Party, California Labor Federation, California Teachers Association, on and on, League of Women Voters, ACLU of Southern California, and California State Strong. Media organizations, Mercury News, East Bay Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Los Angeles Times. Organizations against the California Chamber of Commerce, California Restaurant Association, California Groceries Association, California Republican Party, and of course, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, they're always in there. The media, the Pasadena Star News, and Bakersfield, California. The impacts of Proposition 32. Well, it could have a wide range of effects. And this is a statement that was taken out of the California Legislature Analyst Office. Of course, wages will increase. There will be likely higher costs. And the Analyst Office estimates that to increase, the higher costs would be about 0.5%, and likely lower profits. State and local government costs could increase or decrease by up to hundreds of millions of dollars annually. i.e., essentially, who knows? No one knows what the impact of this will be. Certainly higher government costs will be needed to pay for workers, both employees and contractors. There might be fewer taxes or because revenues will decline for businesses because they're paying their employees more. There might be savings from lower enrollment in health and human services programs. So essentially, as far as other than the fact that costs will most likely go up on what we pay, that the state and local government cost, I think, is probably most likely going to be a wash. Here are some of the resources that I used for the information, and I ask if there's any questions that anyone would have. If there aren't
Yeah.
any questions, oh, go ahead.
This is Joanne. Yeah, wouldn't there be increased payroll taxes if workers are making more money?
It's possible, but that was not one of those items. I think it's going to be offset primarily because you're going to be paying people more as well through the local governments, contractors and things of that sort. I think it's just going to be a wash. You know, I don't think people really know. I think the problem with this proposition is that when the legislature did their the SB3, it was a gradual increase and people could acclimate to it. This is going to be a drastic change from, you know, up to $17 and then $18 the next year. So we might be able to see the costs much more quickly. So that's just my thoughts on that. Now on to Proposition 33, and I'll hand it off to Marla.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. So I have Proposition 33, which would prohibit state limitations on local rent control. So a yes vote would mean state law would not or could not limit the kinds of rent control laws cities and counties could have, while a no vote would mean state laws could continue to limit the kinds of rent control laws that cities and counties could have. Next slide. So the Proposition 33 is called the Justice for Renters Act. It's, as I said, a rent control proposition. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should. In 2018 and in 2020, there were propositions on the ballot that did similar things. It was a little bit different than this one, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but it was about rent control. And so it probably sounds familiar to you. And that's because each of these times, the primary sponsors of these propositions has been the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and its director, Michael Weinstein. So who are these people and organization? The AHF is a Los Angeles-based nonprofit founded in 1987 that provides HIV/AIDS prevention, treatment, and advocacy services. And it has nearly 500 clinics and healthcare centers, pharmacies worldwide. It participates in the Medi-Cal and Medicare drug discount program known as 340B. And it also owns about 15 apartments and rental properties in the LA area, which according to the LA Times, which did an extensive investigation of them last year, many of them are what they would consider squalid conditions. Weinstein himself, the director of AHF, is a controversial figure in the AIDS community in the LA area and statewide. According to the New York Times, in a 2018 article, and I quote, "To his many critics in AIDS activism, Weinstein is the Koch brothers of public health. A mastermind driven by ideology, accountable to no one, with bottomless funds and an agenda marked by financial opportunism and puritanical extremisms." AHF is in what the New York Times described as near constant litigation and complaints of questionable business practices, including union busting, kickbacks, and overbilling of insurers. But Weinstein and AHF do have admirers. I'm sorry, yeah, we'll stay on this slide for a bit. To his admirers, Michael Weinstein, AHF, is the provider of superior healthcare and an evangelist of moral urgency. This is what they say. He's participated in this drug program 340B, which allows pharmacies and clinics serving underprivileged populations to buy drugs directly from the manufacturers at about 35% discount, but be reimbursed by insurers at 100% of the wholesale price. So it's a way of subsidizing prescription drugs for the poor and underprivileged. but because the price of AIDS drugs have skyrocketed, AHF's pharmacies have generated billions of dollars in revenue from this participation in these programs. So why am I telling you all of this? So you'll find out more as I keep talking about this proposition and the next one. But some of that money has been used by Weinstein for various political causes. He's, according to Cal Matters, aggressively lobbied and campaigned against legislation requiring local governments to permit denser housing. I think that was in San Francisco, and he's done the same in LA. And so he's been a controversial figure in the AIDS community, as well as the rental tenant housing area, and criticized for being outside the core mission of AHF. So why am I telling you all this? Okay, stay tuned. It'll become clear in a moment. Next slide. So the key points about Prop 33, rent control. So some cities already limit how much a landlord can raise rent each year. But the state Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995 places limits on those limits. So there can be no rent control on single-family homes or on apartments built after 1995. And landlords must be free to set rental rates with new tenants. So Prop 33 would repeal Costa-Hawkins. And it would also include just 23 words, according to its proponents, which are, this state may not limit the right of any city, county, or city and county to maintain, enact, or expand residential rent control. Next slide. So what are the arguments for? Well, rent is too damn high. And that's, what the proponents say. About 25%, or say over 50% of Californians pay more than 30% of their income on rent, with rent increases outstripping their pay increases. And this proposition would also allow local governments to enact and expand rent control, because what works in Los Angeles doesn't work for Los Gatos necessarily. One size doesn't fit all. So each local government should be able to do what it needs to do for rent control. The proponents also argue that the housing crisis in California is complicated and we need to build more affordable housing. But in the meantime, we need to at least start with keeping people in their homes, and this would help to do that. Rent control has been an American tradition since 1919 and works well in many cities, not just in California, but nationwide. And the California Constitution and court rulings already guarantee a reasonable rate of returns to landlords. So those are the arguments for. Next slide. The arguments against, first, they point out that this was rejected by voters in 2018 and 2020. It's been the same basic arguments each time, and each time it was defeated, roughly 60-40, I think, by the voters. The big difference now, there's a couple of things. In 2020, in 2019, after the 2018 measure failed, the legislature passed and Governor Newsom signed the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which provides that until 2030, it requires just cause for a landlord to evict a tenant, and would also limit annual rent increases to no more than 5% plus local consumer price index inflation, or 10%, whichever is lower, for rentals that were built more than 15 years prior to that. So that protection was put in place in 2019, and the people who argue against this proposition say that this could overturn those laws, as well as other state laws that make it easier to build affordable housing, and other eviction laws, without any protections for renters, because as I just read, or said, it would repeal Costa-Hawkins and also say that the state has no say in rent control. And so they say that's a bad thing because there are already protections that would be overturned with this law. And Stanford and Berkeley economists, these opponents say, have studied it and said that this will make the housing crisis worse. And MIT researchers say home values will be reduced by 25% because landlords would not be as incented, assuming that cities do enact more rent control, that landlords would not be incented to rent out their properties or to buy rental properties. So the values would go down. And the other argument that is made against this proposition is that single-family homeowners who are now protected under Costa-Hawkins would be treated the same as corporate landlords. Next slide. So the supporters, as I said, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, California Democratic Party, kind of a mix, ACLU, California State Strong. Opponents it's somewhat of a mix also. Some you would expect, of course, the California Rental Housing Association, but also the California YIMBY and California State Senate President pro tempore Tony Atkins, as well as State Assembly member Buffy Wicks, who initially were somewhat supportive, or at least they didn't oppose the one in 2020. This time they're concerned about those 23 words that I talked about. So according to Assemblymember Wicks, and she's championed tenant protections as well as laws to make it easier for developers to build more housing. She said this ballot measure will end housing production in California, full stop. So very strong words against it. And also media, generally the major media organizations have come out against it. The LA Times has not yet that I've seen. So I'm not sure why. It was kind of interesting because they've followed AHF and Weinstein pretty closely. But I didn't include in my slide, Prop 33 is the measure on the 2024 ballot in the United States that has the highest, or maybe the second highest, campaign contributions in the nation, and with about $140 million on either for and against, with 40 million in support and 100 million against. So it's there's a lot of money in this, which is kind of sad because we could have used that money for other things instead of this. But are there any questions about Proposition 33? I know you've seen a lot of ads, and that's where that money is going. And there've been allegations on both sides about false statements or misrepresentations in some of this advertising. There was one advertising about, I think it was in opposition to it. I can't remember which one, but it depicted Kamala Harris as being on their side, but she never endorsed it or anything. So there's a lot of information out there about it, and it's not all true. So be careful what you see for ads, because there's a lot of money behind it too. Any questions?
This is Karen. I have a question.
Yeah.
What is in it for Weinstein to be supporting rent control? I guess I don't quite understand.
Yeah, that's what I tried to figure out too. And I looked at some of those LA Times articles about him and the New York Times. I don't know. The thing I keep thinking about though is that Costa-Hawkins is probably, and LA rent control are probably things that he is impacted by, because his buildings tend to be on the older side, and so they could be subject to rent control. I never found confirmation of this, but I just, those two things are true, that older buildings are subject to it, and LA has some rent control. So I don't know if that's why, like he wants more local control over it as opposed to state. I don't know. I can't figure it out. And that was kind of why I read some of the stuff about him. He seems a bit of a gadfly that has a lot of money and just kind of spends it on different things that he thinks is, worthwhile. But it's just, I think what concerns me is in this new proposition is the language about the state not having any say at all in it, and what that could mean. It's again, as somebody else mentioned in an earlier presentation, the unintended consequences of it all. I think we don't really know, and that's why the opponents point out, it could be 100 or more state laws that are impacted by it. So we just don't know, and so it's it's a bit of a gamble. And you take away some of the protections that are in state law right now without any assurance that local governments would be able to put any of those back into place. So if they haven't done it already. And in fact, some cities, I think it's Huntington Beach, some of their leaders who are on the conservative side had said they would, drive a truck through that loophole, saying that the state has no say in rent control, and they would characterize their local zoning issues as rent control so that, the state couldn't regulate it. So for example, if the state would otherwise require more affordable housing, they would try to get around it by, characterizing it as rent control, which is part of the reason why Tony Atkins and Buffy Wicks do not support this proposition. And I think California YIMBY as well. Any other questions? So so that didn't really answer your question because I couldn't find a direct answer to it. He just seems to have a lot of money to burn. So. Okay, so if there are no questions, let's move on to Proposition 34, which is related. Oh, no, I guess I still have to go over it. I'm sorry, I didn't go over fiscal impact. Jennifer, yes, I see your question about why is California state strong? I don't know. I didn't participate in the meetings on that. The California Democratic Party supports it as well. And I think because they want to see more rent control and local rent control. My concern is that just the way that this proposition does it is not the right way. And I also don't like propositions that are complicated and have more impacts than meet the eye and unintended consequences of it. Passing it, what that could mean down the road and how that could hamper state efforts to deal with affordable housing and other issues. And so those are my concerns. I don't know. I'm assuming it's the top line. We need, to protect renters and rent is too damn high. And those are the sorts of considerations that went into that, but I don't know. So fiscal impacts, I should address. The Legislative Analyst Office say that, it all depends on what local governments decide to do, but most likely it would mean that tenants who are subject to rent control would pay less, but other tenants would pay more. Renters would probably move less often. There'd be fewer homes available to rent. Rental housing values would decline, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Reduce property tax revenues and increase local government costs because they would have to administer and enforce these local rent controls. So, and then some of the resources I use, I obviously did other research, like with the LA Times, as I mentioned, which had a number of articles about AHF and Weinstein. But those are ones that talk about the proposition itself. Okay, now I can move on, unless there are any other questions about 33. Okay, so 34 is related, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the description. So it restricts spending of prescription drug revenues by certain healthcare providers. So a yes vote would mean healthcare entities meeting specific requirements would have to follow new rules about how they spend revenue from the federal drug discount program, which I mentioned earlier, the 340B. A no vote would mean those new rules would not go into effect. Okay, so next slide. So we already talked a bit about the Medi-Cal Medicare drug discount program, 340B, which is the discount on pharmaceuticals. That where it would allow pharmacies and clinics to buy drugs directly from manufacturers at a discount, but be reimbursed by insurers for 100% of the wholesale price. Apparently, how these healthcare providers spend the profits from this is not restricted by Medicare or Medi-Cal. Presumably, it would go toward a more patient care, healthcare services to the disadvantaged groups, which is the purpose behind it. But there is no actual restriction on that. So why is Prop 33 on the ballot? Well, Cal Matters says the short answer is that a lot of politicians and housing interest groups really don't like Michael Weinstein. And I would add the AHF, which are behind Prop 33, as we just saw. So next slide. So the key points with Proposition 34, it would require certain healthcare providers to spend 98% of revenues from the federal discount drug program on direct patient care. That sounds all well and good, except that the proposition only applies to a healthcare provider that meets these 4 requirements. First, it has to participate in that 340B drug discount program. Second, it has to have a license in California to operate a health plan, pharmacy, or clinic. 3, it has to have spent over $100 million in any 10-year period on anything other than direct patient care. And 4th, it has to own or operate multifamily housing, reported to have 500 or more high-severity health and safety violations. Okay, so who would that apply to? Next slide, please. Yeah, it's only AHF. As far as anyone can tell, it would only apply to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. So just reviewing what I said about them before on an earlier slide, it has nearly 500 clinics, including obviously some in California, participates in the 340B program, owns about 15 or so apartment and rental properties, which have been cited with a number of healthcare violations. And between just 2015 and 2020, which is the only period I could find information for, it has contributed, it and Weinstein have contributed over $110 million to ballot measure campaigns. So obviously it only applies, as far as anyone can tell, with all the sources I consulted, nobody knows of anyone else that would meet these 4 specific requirements. So it's the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And we will see also it would affect Weinstein because some of the penalties for non-compliance would mean the entity's healthcare licenses would be revoked, as well as its tax exempt status, make it ineligible for state and local government contracts and grants, and its leaders could not serve in leadership roles in a California health plan, pharmacy, or clinic. It also, Prop 34, would permanently authorize the state to negotiate Medi-Cal drug prices on a statewide basis, known as Medi-Cal RX. So before 2019, Medi-Cal used different ways to pay for the cost of prescription drugs. And then in 2019, adopted a single approach so that it could pay for drugs at a more discounted price. I didn't really get into the details about how they do it exactly. I just know that it's something that the state is doing and saves the state money, but it's not formally enacted in state law. They're just doing it this way. So Prop 34 would enact that into state law. So some of the arguments for, next slide, please. It would enact Medi-Cal RX into law, as I just mentioned. It would protect patients and ensure public healthcare dollars would actually go to the patients who need it, which is the purpose of the 340B drug program. And it would close the loophole and provide needed transparency and rein in abuse. Obviously, the arguments against, would be made by AHF and Weinstein, that they call it the revenge initiative. And, they say that the measure is illegal and therefore unenforceable because both the US and state constitutions prohibit a law from singling out a single person or organization for punishment. So those laws are known as bills of attainder. It's basically going around the due process requirements, going through a court to punish someone, and instead using a legislative, or in this case, a proposition to punish someone. So they actually, the AHF actually, filed a lawsuit on this when this first was proposed to be put on the ballot, and the state Supreme Court declined to remove the proposition from the ballot at this time, but said that if it passed, it would take up the matter again if it, were litigated, which obviously it would be. So if Prop 34 passes, it will almost certainly end up back in court, and I assume it would be struck down as not legal, because I don't see how they could get around the argument that it is specifically directed at AHF and Weinstein because of how specific the requirements are drafted. I mean, maybe there's someone else out there that meets all of those requirements, but none of the sources I consulted, nobody else in California can find one. So it's likely not to survive a court challenge in my view. Let's see, next slide. Supporters for Prop 34, it's basically the inverse of 33 with a few others coming along. As Karen said, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, of course, they're part of it. Some others, ALS, I think the top line of it sounds good, requiring them to actually provide patient care. But again, the way it's being done is not really the right way. And so, so the opponents include, of course, AHF, as well as the League of Women Voters of California and California Straight Strong. And then pretty much all major media sources also say that it shouldn't, it should be opposed. And Prop 34 also, there's a fair amount of money. I think the last I checked, it was 30 million. I forgot to look at that, but yeah, there's quite a bit of money behind it. Not as much as 33, but a fair amount it's like the second highest, I think, of the propositions in California as far as the money that's behind it. Next slide. Fiscal impact, obviously, if it only affects the one organization, probably none. And if it's struck down, really none. It's just kind of a waste of time, really, in my view. Here's some of the resources on it. And does anyone have any questions? It's, interesting. One of those vanity kinds of propositions, I think, that people with a lot of money just can spend it to put on the ballot. And if there are no questions, we're going to move on to Prop 35. And that is Keith.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Marla, for such a great job on that somewhat complicated double issue there. Proposition 35 would make permanent the existing temporary tax on managed healthcare insurance plans. Those are dubbed MCO in the voter handbook, managed care organizations, which, if it's approved by the federal government, would provide revenues to pay for a significant part of the cost of providing Medi-Cal services. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Basically, it's a bump in how much people who provide services to Medi-Cal patients get paid. A yes vote, the current tax is paid by health plan providers, people like Kaiser, and used by the state to help cover the cost of providing Medi-Cal services would be modified and made permanent. Right now, the tax is temporary. It has to be renewed every 3 years. The net result should generate about 2 billion more per year for this purpose, according to the measure's proponents. Now, a no vote would make it so that unless the legislature acts to extend the current temporary tax on the MCOs, healthcare providers, the current tax would expire in 2026. And that would potentially reduce the funds used to help pay for Medi-Cal patients by up to $7 to $8 billion per year. So it would be a big impact. Okay, next slide, please. So the background for Proposition 35 is, as I said, California reimposed a 3-year temporary tax on certain size health plans. And that's based on the number of members they serve. And again, with the tax expiring in 2026, the proponents for Proposition 35 want to make this tax permanent and at the same time create new rules on how the money can be allocated that comes in from this MCO tax. So why is Prop 35 on the ballot? So a coalition of healthcare providers, including hospitals, doctors, medical transport companies, and others, want to require the state to pay higher fees for providing services to Medi-Cal patients. They have dubbed this proposition the, quote, Protect Access to Healthcare initiative. So again, a spiffy title. Next slide, please. So the key points, there's no doubt that healthcare professionals have long complained about the very low payments for services provided to Medi-Cal patients. They have been capped, the payments, far below what non-Medi-Cal patients pay. As a result, some healthcare providers now refuse to see Medi-Cal patients. By making the healthcare provider tax permanent and requiring nearly all of those tax revenues to be used for fee increases and expanded areas of coverage for Medi-Cal patients, Prop 35 backers would be paid more, so they would get a raise. And it's an interesting fact that, like on one of the other propositions, both the California Democratic and Republican parties back Proposition 35. Okay, thank you. The federal government provides significant funding to help cover overall Medi-Cal expenses. And this is a key point. They must approve any California legislation or tax plans that impact how Medi-Cal is funded. So no matter whether this proposition passes, it's still subject to a federal review and approval. Proposition 35 will mandate which medical services get funding increases and which will no longer be covered, including one that was a bit of a red flag for me of concern. Proposition 35 would eliminate mandatory coverage for children aged 0 to 5 years old. And I'll say more about that in a minute. If implemented, Prop 35 will reduce money that can be used for Medi-Cal administration costs or be added to the state's general fund, which is now how some of this tax money flows, goes into the general fund and then gets allocated to Medi-Cal. So if passed, the bill would require nearly all taxes collected again to go to patient care. Next slide, please. Okay. If the law currently in the books expires, this tax, the cost to the state will rise, according to the legislative analyst, for providing Medi-Cal services, since the major health plans in California will no longer be chipping in to help cover costs. Making the law permanent helps to ensure that the funds will be available to cover increasing costs for Medi-Cal services. We all know that prices rise inexorably, so they're not going down. And then the third argument for is that it avoids having to get the legislature to approve the temporary tax every 3 years moving forward into the future. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the arguments against No one actually filed an argument against Proposition 35 for the Secretary of State. You'll see in your voter guide, it's blank. Now, Ballotpedia, however, reported that the editors of both the Chronicle in San Francisco and the San Jose Mercury News, Bay Area news group, urged a no vote on 35. Mainly because they both argue that the fiscal impacts of this proposition, if passed, were not fully known and might result in unintentional problems to Medi-Cal and its funding sources. The Chronicle stated that rather than using a ballot measure to address the issue, legislators should develop new laws to offer a better solution. The Mercury News was more direct and said, quote, "The winners in this special interest funding measure would be the doctors, hospitals, and emergency ambulance providers bankrolling the initiative." Next slide, please. The voter guide also states, again, that the federal government must approve the tax and will determine how much it will continue to pay into Medi-Cal if the new law passes. The voter guide says, quote, "The proposition's long-term effects on tax revenue, health program funding, and state costs are unknown." Among those who oppose Proposition 35, the California League of Women Voters are one. And they traditionally have been against this way of moving forward with laws. They have repeatedly said that they are against so-called ballot box budgeting, and they describe the proposition as, quote, "well-meaning but a misguided effort that may make it difficult to respond to future changes to Medi-Cal mandated by the federal government." They also state that it's an incredibly complex budgeting issue, and again, as the Chronicle said, the legislature should take it up in a more transparent way to address it. The Children's Partnership is an alliance of healthcare providers who are focused on creating healthcare equitability and access, especially for the least privileged in our communities. They also oppose Proposition 35, and they state, quote, "Prop 35 rolls back investments that have been made in community health workers, community behavioral health, and services that support seniors with Alzheimer's, as well as funding to ensure that children ages 0 to 5 don't lose Medi-Cal coverage at the most critical time for brain development." And finally, our esteemed Governor Newsom has also expressed concerns that Prop 35 will limit the state's future financial flexibility. Okay, so next slide, please. So the supporters are primarily this loose coalition I described, calling themselves the Coalition to Provide Access to Care. And again, this includes the California Medical Association, the California Hospital Association, EMTs and paramedic associations, there's 2 of those, the Association of Dentists, associations for pediatricians, OBGYNs, and Planned Parenthood, because they are a big service provider for many in our community. And they collectively have raised now, when I wrote this, it was 45 million. It's now over $50 million to support the measure. And you've probably seen their appeal ads running on television and radio. They feature prominently healthcare workers asking for support to be able to keep providing health care to those who most need it. They're playing at our heartstrings. The opponents include the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, the Children's Partnership, who I mentioned, and there's a link to their website and their news release on why they oppose 35. The California Alliance of Retired Americans, Courage California, California State Strong, and the League of Women Voters, again, are all in opposition to the measure. And I think fiscal impact, we're just about done. So there would be no change to state tax revenue at the present time because we're in the middle of the period where this existing temporary tax and law is running. If Stop 35 were put into play, it would boost funding for Medi-Cal and other health programs by requiring the state to spend more health tax revenue for funding increases. So in a sense, less money for other parts of how Medi-Cal runs and more just for the people who provide the services. And then it would increase state administrative costs, it's estimated by the budget office, by 1 to 2 billion annually, as again, since the health plan tax revenues would be given for providers, someone's got to administer the plan. And so the state would have to dig into its wallet to cover that. And then the longer term impacts are unknown and may affect future federal funding for Medi-Cal, which to me is another cause for concern. So I listed the sources I relied on there. There's links to all of them there. The voter guide, the California League of Women Voters, Ballotpedia has a lot of information on this issue. The Children's Partnership release, that's the one I quoted about the children 0 to 5 losing their automatic coverage. And then Cal Matters has 2 articles on it, and this is the most current one. So again, it's a little complicated, and on the surface, it sounds great. But when you look below, there's a lot of potential ramifications that are unknown at this time. So thanks very much. And are there any questions about Prop 35?
Hi, Keith, it's Marla. So why did the California Democratic Party support this, do you think?
Yeah, I tried to get some information on that, and all I was able to come up with is sort of the line used in the ads that they believe that it will help better support the frontline healthcare workers and health providers who are being underpaid at this time. So they looked at it kind of as an economic issue for healthcare professionals. That's the only little bit I could find about that. Again, it's one both the Democrats and Republicans were supporting. This is just my guess. When you look at who make up the coalition to provide access to care, those organizations all have lobbying arms, I believe, and they're probably quite active in Sacramento with talking this up. So that could be, but I don't have evidence to factually substantiate that. Are there any other questions? Yeah, again, my takeaway is that on the surface, it looks like a good thing. But again, as you dig deeper and check sources like Cal Matters and Ballotpedia, you realize there are so many potential unknown consequences. It could really unleash a big mess for Medi-Cal, especially if the federal government doesn't see eye to eye with this proposition. So, okay, I guess we're going to move on, and I'm going to turn off my light and put it on Helen, who will be discussing Prop 36, which is our final proposition for today's session. And thanks to all our members for sticking on the call.
Okay, so Prop 36, Drug and Theft Crime Penalties and Treatment Mandated Felonies Initiative. Yes, will reclassify some misdemeanor theft and drug crimes as felonies and create a new category of crime, a treatment mandated felony. A no vote, punishment for drug and theft crimes will remain the same as it has been. Okay, Karen. Prop 36 background. Felonies are the most serious type of crimes, punishable by sentencing to county jail, state prison, or in some cases, supervision by a county probation officer for some or all of the sentence. Generally, the length of the sentence depends on the seriousness and details of the crime. Sentences can range up to 15 years or more. Misdemeanors are less serious crimes, punishable by county jail, community supervision, or a fine. Sentences can be up to a year in jail. In 2014, voters approved Proposition 47, which reduced some theft and drug crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, partially as a response to California's overcrowded prison system, which the Fed said we had to take care of, but also because harsh sentences didn't seem to be working. During the pandemic, rates of shoplifting and commercial burglaries skyrocketed, especially in large cities. Prosecutors, police, and large retailers have blamed Prop 47 for the increase. Okay, Karen? So, if Prop 37 was placed on the ballot by petition signatures, Proposition 36 increases punishment for some drug and theft crimes, turns some misdemeanors into felonies, and lengthens some felony sentences, and requires some felonies to be served in prison. It creates a new treatment-focused court process for some drug possession crimes. Some drug possession cases can be charged with a treatment-mandated felony, in quotes, instead of a misdemeanor. These people would receive treatment, mental health, or drug treatment. If they finish the treatment, charges are dismissed. If they don't finish treatment, they can serve up to 3 years in prison. Proposition 36, the 3 years in state prison is more than their original sentence would have been. And Proposition 36 doesn't provide any more money for treatments. It requires a warning of possible murder charges for selling or providing drugs. Warning could be given to those convicted of selling or providing certain dangerous drugs, making it more likely that they could be convicted of murder if they later sell or provide the illegal drugs to someone who dies. Okay, Karen? So the argument for $14.7 million has been raised. And when you see who's supporting it, you'll know why. Tougher laws will make our community safer and hold repeat criminals accountable. And 4 also says that it combats homelessness by increasing penalties for drug possession, pushing people into treatment and off the street. Again, against 4.6 million raised. No studies support the idea that harsher punishment or the threat of harsher punishment prevents crime or homelessness. Will hundreds of millions of dollars in court and prison costs will cost hundreds of millions of dollars in court and prison costs without proof of success, while reducing funds for schools, healthcare, and treatment programs. And will return to war on drugs, which Californians rejected with Prop 37. A note on the, while it will reduce funds for schools, healthcare, et cetera. Prop 47, which gave people convicted lighter sentences, therefore saving money by them not having prison sentences in felonies. The money that was saved had to go for truancy programs, health treatment, mental health treatment, drug treatment programs, social programs that would reduce homelessness. That will no longer be in existence because the money would be put back into the prison system. Again, no money from Prop 36 is being put into to provide more drug treatment centers, which we have problems with already. And another consideration, well, Karen, go on to the next one. Supporters, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, California District Attorneys Association, California Correctional Peace Officers Association, California Republican Party, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, California Chamber of Commerce. Against Governor Gavin Newsom, though I believe he originally supported it and has changed his mind in the last couple of months. Alliance for Safety and Justice, ACLU of Northern California, California Democratic Party, League of Women Voters of California, California State Strong, and ICJJ, which I can never remember. It's the Interfaith Coalition for Justice in Jails. The fiscal impact will increase state criminal justice costs, increase in state prison population, and increase in state court workload, will increase local criminal justice costs, increase in county jail and community service population, and increase in local court-related workload. One of the other considerations that people have made is, since this was introduced to the ballot, there have been over 11 pieces of legislation signed into law which have been introduced to counter the crime, including retail theft. By the way, these Props 36, neither Prop 36 nor Prop 47 deal with the grab and go retail crime problem. Okay, Karen. And the California Voters Guide, ACLU, Cal Matters, Stop Prop, Yes Prop, and when we post this, I will add the ICJJ article about it. So, and it's going back again to be hard on drugs, which didn't seem to work too well. Any questions?
Helen, this is Marla. I have a question. Does this change the felony threshold? Because I think it had been changed like to $950 or something, because I heard a lot of criticism on Prop 47 about that. But I had looked into the numbers, and actually the $950 under Prop 47 is among the lowest in the nation. Many more states have much more than that for the felony threshold. Like Texas, for example, is $2,500.
Right, it does. And so more people will be charged with felonies than with misdemeanors. Yes, and it is one of the lowest. It doesn't raise it, if I'm correct with that. And the idea is to punish people more, give them harsher sentences, thinking that that will prevent them from doing the crime, which has never been proved to work. And it also, at least to me, seems to say that people who are homeless have a choice. And if they are not doing drugs, they would not be homeless. But so it punishes people who are given a drug who are given a treatment possibility, but who are not able to complete that treatment, with giving them a longer felony sentence than they would have had to begin with.
Well, and also you said there's no money for more treatment. So will there even be sufficient resources for that?
Probably not, since we really don't have sufficient resources right now. No guarantee. Again, this is to me, sort of a knee-jerk reaction to we're having a lot of more property crime, maybe, but a lot of it's from the pandemic. And yeah, Jennifer.
Hi, Helen.
Hi.
I teach at Elmwood Jail in Milpitas, and so I'm working with incarcerated individuals, and I just wanted to point out that anytime someone has a felony conviction, it's really hard for them to reintegrate into society, and sometimes those people end up, in and out of jail or prison for life. So, and really, I think addiction's at the root of a lot of this. So I just wanted to make that comment.
I think it's a great comment because there've been many, many, many news shows about how once you have a felony conviction, how hard it is to go back. No matter, even if you are straight, even if you're an ideal candidate, how hard it is to just get hired back in society. And yeah, I think addiction is a major problem. This is not necessarily a way to cure it, if it can be cured or to treat it. Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That was good. Anyone else? Okay. So, any questions about any of the previous propositions? Okay, so we're going to end the meeting soon, not quite early. Please vote early. Get everyone you know to do the same. It stops people from organizations from reminding you to vote, which is important. We would like, even if your family, your friends live in a very blue area, ask them to vote. We really would like to maximize the popular vote. In case there are any questions from about the validity of the vote. For more actions, there's still quite a bit of time for more actions for text banking, phone banking, canvassing. Please go to our website and scroll to the bottom, and there's a whole list of, there's a link for a list of all the kinds of things you can do. Our next very tentative meeting is scheduled for November 17th at the library. Normal time 1:30 to 3:30, which we will be doing a debrief. Again, this is tentative, a debrief of the election, and we very, very, very much hope we will be in celebration mode by then. And anyone else need to say anything? Want to remind everybody of anything? I guess that's it. Thank you very much for coming. And goodbye. And vote, please vote.